pasted under photo of my children, their soft, warm faces in shadow, in the glare of the blue dart windshield barnacled with ice 7 years ago, torn off a 7-Up carton last night from Piggly Wiggly. No deposit, no return. But what have I given? Now I can't see my children enough, can't find their eyes for the shadow, for the glare of a 12-year winter, the power cut off, the lines down, the bridges iced over, the roads closed, over the mountains. When we were cut off, when I cut her off, when their mother reached down with the cutters and severed the conductors, when I no longer reached through them to her. God, what have I given? No deposit, no return. Last night I dreamed of you again, of waiting for you, looking for you. You were elsewhere, yet you'd promised you'd come to the meeting. We were on the way to the chapel. A crowd passed on the sidewalk. I looked for you on the sidewalk, in the corridors of Divinity. A professor and poet was speaking. It was an evening service. I was uneasy because you were late, and you'd said we shouldn't meet. I looked into the chapel, saw you weren't there, started to leave, then entered one of the pews, sat down and noticed beside me a woman sitting with a hooded infant propped against the back of the pew between us. The woman leaned forward toward the hymnals, looked around at me in a friendly way, and lifted the bonnet from the child's face. She wanted me to speak with the child, since it didn't often see people outside the family, and since there was something unusual about it, which kept it from a normal life. The infant had 2 foreheads, one built upon the other, and 2 sets of eyes, 2 separate centers, which looked at me and reflected, but one lower face and body. I saw the 2 sets of eyes, the 2 thoughts of me, under the hood, looking back at me, and the mouth moving without words, chewing spittle, the tongue licking its lips, and felt myself looking back at them, repressing horror. I began to speak in a normal voice, to calm myself and hold its attention, or theirs. I began to speak with the child as the woman wished, in the waiting sanctuary, in the absence of the service, waiting for you. Later we spoke again in the vestibule, with the child perched inside, staring over the sill at me without. As the congregation brushed past, I continued our conversation, though the eyes were unbearable, waiting for you. Protect me, you savage spirits. Let me bear your eyes, to lay them down at your feet, with mine on the secret altars where we burn to see, with my poems and her dreams, and with what is left of my life here on this worn mountain, banked beneath the embers in the evening sky. I dream of being severed, cut loose and floating down into the dark like a maple wing, spiraling out of the sun. But the core, the seed inside, wants out of its husk. It's like working on a stone bridge made of stalactites, condensing drop by drop out of dreams, out of the work done, out of the tears of the fragile beings I've caused to suffer. There is no stopping place, no turning point, no return. I'm way out over it now, and the fall is endless. But maybe the trains will pass over, with all their transports, through link on link, word on word, that bear the vibrations, the massive connections, the recollections in chains, the long supply lines trickling out of dreams into the desert that will not stop for me. A sharp point struck. He bent his head on a hillside. It was the night he saw. Again, and a shadow flapped on his forehead. In the hollows of his memory, the light again darkened. He wondered if he is in Durham, high up in the barred room, on the top floor. A tranquilized husk, a robot unable to speak, to remember who he is, stripped of every recognition, struck, but most strikingly, because he was a mingler, always making contact, of company, of his awareness, and the attentions of his fellows. The pitiful denizens of the ward who wander past him, drugged and lobotomized, whose harmless, oblivious stares swarm in their quietude about the sitcom, booming from the massive set in the center of the room. So changed, the doctor has to point him out to me, crouched on an empty bench, back in the farthest corner where no one else is, bowed over with his head in his hands, unbuttoned, stubble-bearded, stoned, staring at nothing, downward. I could not recognize my father, because he was spent, because he was beaten completely, because he had quit. His loftiest strongholds overrun, crushed, totally evacuated by the sinister, invisible disease, the biceps and hypodermics which subdued him bodily when he resisted, so that his body also, the last garrisoned core of his resistance in its last retreat, was broken, the husk hollowed out. Dropped from the shuddering blinds, he blundered from the roadbed, staggering toward the smell of corn before the husks, whispering. In the sudden gust below the trestle, the withered, nervous man collided with the fence, and the shock bobbed his head in an arc over the wire, and he lost his spectacles, and his body rebounded, and he reached out slowly. His hand closed fast and opened, and he bowed over the field. His locomotive crept up the hillside, then dry stalks whispered thinly. He stood upright and bowed, trembling with the wire he could not see. He let it go and stood in the colorless twilight. His knees gave way. He lowered his body and knelt. One iron furrow sanded his fingertips. He felt into the crevices. The light darkened. He withdrew his hands and sent them forward, searching, furtive. The ground felt unearthly, like metal. Snow filled the cracks. His sleeve caught on a barb. The wire lashed him. He tore himself free. Hand over hand, clawing from wire to wire, he struggled to stand. He saw nothing. Dry air, odorless, crossed the field, filled his nostrils. A sharp point struck and stabbed. He flexed his fingers, closed them. The wire quivered. He clutched it with all his strength, and the fence post shook. He brought his hand to his mouth. He placed it on the wire. He heard the distant sound of friction. He ran his palm on the wire. The wind rose, stalks rustled. A dry tip tickled his eyelids, teasing them like a feather. A shadow flapped on his forehead. The light again darkened. He wondered if it was the night he saw. The wind calmed and he was moving, guiding on the wire. The dark air rose depthless between his feet, before his face. He lifted one arm for balance and found a post. Then he lifted the other hand, perilously. Stumbling, he lost balance. His fingers slid to a barb. The taut wire shook him and swayed low. He held himself close to the earth, soothing the wire, outstretched, motionless. He lunged for the post and fell, was lashed and trembled, hoisted himself, and swayed in the calm. He extended his arms and crept on the tips of his toes. His fingers fled from the barbs, and quailing caressed them. He could not cease moving, for the wire would not cease moving. He remembered the coldness of earth, and the crevices of earth. The wire throbbed over the earth, steadily. Rushing noise came from his body. Mucus foamed to his lips. He could not spit it from his teeth. His mouth would not open. His tongue stuck to his lips. He lifted his palm to his mouth and sucked his wrists. There was not enough blood. He tore his mouth open, cried out, retched, and spat. Tall, he lowered his head and lifted his other hand until his arms stretched wide above the field. After a long while the fence did not end, and the man stepped past one post after another. When he stumbled, he no longer fell. The barbs became less jagged. The blood dropped, smoothing long strands along the wire. The wire shook him, and they fought each other. The intervals between the posts lengthened. And he heard his train passing over hills. The sound became a humming noise within him, from which he always receded. In the air there was a rustling of dry husks, and a sudden cry, snatched close from mountain walls, the wail of a child or an animal. The train climbed and passed away from him, and he heard himself hear nothing. Dust and mortal cursed my father. He heard nothing, and distances drew close about the wire. Dark vistas once before him gathered behind him in the space of the field, far from him, within him. Why he came he did not remember, or what he had lost, or where he had begun, or to hope for its end, or to pause, or to fear. But the wire had become familiar. It supported him and led him, and its pain gave him forgetfulness. His other hand, wrenched free, stabbed for a post, and he sank through an emptiness. He was aware of nightfall and remembered his fear. He acknowledged without protest that he had moved for a long while and could not cease, even from falling. He rose again slowly. The wire had turned. He followed. He toiled a level ground. He bent his head on a hillside. Again and again he turned in the hollows of his memory. The cavities in his knees spread into his belly, his chest, his throat. He felt himself floating with the paralyzed, inert movement of a dream. When he tried to recover, he lost himself in his blindness, in the space of the field. But the wire held him. The punctuated strands smoothed down his hands, and the wire became smooth. Dust and mortal cursed my father. The wire held him upright and kept him moving because he could not move alone. Dust and mortal cursed my father. The wire became his direction because alone he was lost. Dust and mortal cursed my father. He and the wire were one thing, for together they consumed him. Wrapped in a flowing fever, he forgot his hunger and coldness, the wind and the sounds of the night, the darkness around him, and the fear of falling. He remembered the wire, and possessing no other memory, he felt that he had known it forever. Dream last night. Fire in my father's house, started by my wood stove. Chimney fire that spewed up flame and ash high into the air and laid down black debris all over town, on every side. Dad going out with me, poking the clinkers, touring our yard, which was also the college grounds. But he wasn't bothered, only, we'll rake it up in the morning, it's okay. Then he was inside by the hearth, and I on the threshold, and he was glad to see me there, and welcomed me as no one else ever could. The light buried so deep in his face that it would never go out, smoldering in the smile and radiating in wave on wave of warmth, kindling, focused in the eyes toward mine. I wonder on waking how often such mercy happened to me. What is more real, the dream or the life the dream condenses? One drop of essence is all I want, to to pass through the nightmare whole, one freely given, like the very life, and so received. It is why I am here. But what a burden. What a release it is. But what a burden. What a burden to say, what have I given?
Encounter with Sylvia outside the restaurant. She's sitting alone at a sidewalk table with a glass of wine. It's the only available place, so I sit down and we begin to talk. She asks what I do. I say I write. Her lovely eyes light up. Then she asks who's my favorite writer. I reply instantly, without knowing she's Austrian, Georg Trakl. Trakl? She smiles. Georg Trakl? Oh, and why, might I ask? Sylvia the beautiful beams, and I am emboldened, sensing that for once in my life I might have made the right move. Because, well, take a word like Reiter. Reiter entlang an Rogenfelden, leeren Mühlen. You hear the fall at the beginning of the line, Reiter, and at the end of it, Mühlen. But it's not just the end of the line. It's the end of a life, of a way of life, a civilization. Reiter, Mühlen. Sylvia is stunned, thrilled too, and speechless. I'm invited to her apartment to listen to Werner's reading of Trakl, which she has on a record. But I don't much like Werner's reading, and, alas, say so, squandering all my credit with Sylvia. All the chips I'd piled up so effortlessly with a single throw. I've written, Nur ein wenig zu gemütlich, es fällt Grodeck. Comfortable, educated, civilized, the voice of an actor, too polished, too aware of his audience to contain the special timbre of Trakl's sorrow, to hear the vibration at the end of a word, the stress on each syllable when it opens, on the space of departure at the end of a world. Reiter, Mühlen, Abschied. It lacks the desolation of loneliness, of opium, of terror, of catastrophe, of the moment before death. There's a difference between declamation and being, between what the voice strives to achieve through willed emphasis and what is achieved only by being, emphatically, by letting the word be. Trakl's voice is of a threshold where Trakl stood without ever entering. Because it was unconsummated, his baptism, his marriage, his Catholicism, because what took place within the room was a sacrament, impossible for him. So he sang out of them, of Abschied, of the departed ones, of a realm both sacred and inaccessible. One cannot place Trakl. He belongs nowhere. The civilization cannot contain him. He belongs to poetry. On a battlefield where a ritual slaughter takes place, where the poem is the altar, where he is the slayer and the slain, the one who builds the fire and the one consumed. At Grodak, in Grodak, Trackle sings his prelude to the century. I have in Sylvia's handwriting, Oscar Werner reads Trackle Deutsche Grammophon. When you hear Werner, you hear civilization, a kinship of listening minds, an auditorium which Trackle could never enter, and his refusal to enter, or his incapacity to enter, and his insistence in sustaining that incapacity, made him the poet that he was. All these low-slung buildings are like trains passing into the dark, low, broken brothers, repeating each other, huddling together in the mire, against the low sky. In the distance, I hear him prophesying, whispering and mourning, my brother. My century is a locomotive, traveling into the desert toward death.